it was fun getting serious about games.
No. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Building 72, the podcast from the Entertainment Arts and Engineering program. We're super excited to talk to Roger Altizer, who's actually one of the founders of Entertainment Arts and Engineering program. And I'm Corinne Lewis. I'm a professor in the program, and we're joined, as always, with my good friend Adam Hunter, who is our industry and alumni relations manager. And we're going to talk about the weirdest term I've ever heard in video games, because I feel like it doesn't tell us anything. So we're going to talk about serious games.
Awesome. I'm excited about it. Well, you know, all the other games are not serious, right?
Right.
Dark Souls is not serious.
Right.
Warcraft is not serious.
So Roger, yeah. So Roger, will you introduce yourself to all of our students?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Roger Altizer. It's nice to virtually meet you. I am an associate professor in Entertainment Arts and Engineering and Population Health Sciences, co-founder of Entertainment Arts and Engineering more than a decade ago now, I guess. And I have a funny job where I hold a few different positions on campus. So on main campus, I teach video games and I teach the capstone class. And then up in health sciences, where I'm joined and appointed, I run the Therapeutic Games and Apps Lab, which is arguably the largest lab of its kind in the nation. We have anywhere between, every semester, between 25 and 35 students funded on research projects, and they span all sorts of stuff. And so what that means is we're doing about $1 million a year in funded research with anywhere from 6 to a dozen different partners every year. They can be clinicians like nurses and doctors or psychologists, or they can be people who run museums, and we make museum games. And if you've played museum games at the Natural History Museum of Utah, those were games that came out of our lab. So a whole spectrum of things. But our core goal up there really is to take this games development culture and use that alongside science to create new and exciting innovations, right? And sort of challenge the culture of those things. So we're building software and we're all learning along the way. Oh, and I'm also the director for digital medicine for the Center for Medical Innovation, which I guess will soon mean that we're going to be prescribing games for you. And I've been asked to sit on a lot of committees for that. So fun stuff. Oh,
that's cool. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's exciting, right? All that changed this summer. We've got our first prescribable video game. Not us, Achille
right.
did.
I think I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, now that's a huge growing field.
Cool.
So Roger, I was going to frame this whole thing. I was going to be like, let's pretend that I know nothing about serious games.
Sure.
But the joke is that I know very little about serious games, to the point where even through all my industry experience, I never heard the term serious games until a couple years ago when I heard it mentioned in passing. So for the uninitiated, because I imagine I'm probably not the only one in that boat, what does that mean? What is a serious game?
You know, Adam, I'm actually going to give you 2 answers to that. And the first one is I can explain to you why you hadn't heard about it in industry, because that's actually really normal. I meet a lot of really experienced and senior developers who are like, what's all this nonsense? And who are these people making serious games? And what do you mean it's a massive industry, right? For some reason, back in the 80s, the worlds of simulation and commercial video games divided. So much so to the point that the people in flight sim and all of that, at that time, they were slightly ahead graphically of where commercial games were, because computing power wasn't strong enough to run simulations, right? Or PCs weren't strong enough. So you had all these big specialty computers. As a result, until recently, like really recently, like last year, the simulation industry was building its own video cards, had its own language for graphics, had a totally different development pipeline than games. And it was so confusing that when people in simulation would meet with companies like Havoc, they didn't trust each other and wouldn't believe what they would say. So like a lot of people in simulation don't understand the potential of procedural graphics or AI run animation or a lot of this stuff that we automate in games now. And vice versa, a lot of people in games don't understand the scale of things that can be simulated. So like a large map in a game might be a couple of miles, right? And that's a massive piece of terrain to do. And in simulations, they're doing things that are continents, right? And you could go seamlessly to the end of the continent without loading, right? Something's Bridget, like Microsoft Flight Simulator. But so they're two really separate industries, and a lot of times people have a hard time crossing from one to another because of those language and tech barriers. And so not as much cross-pollination as you would think, which is really funny. It's actually one of our missions at the Gap Lab is to sort of say, these students and our partners who really understand game tech could really have a positive influence on the development of serious games of simulation, as well as the culture, right? And that's a big part of it for me personally, is game development culture is really cool and really agile and can help us out. But what is a serious, like, I did not answer your question, right? What
I see what you're doing here.
You like that? You like that? Yeah, and over here on the left, right? A serious game is, there's another term that I think makes it's just as vague and terrible, but it's useful in these situations, and it's games with a purpose. And so, and what that's shorthand for is games with a purpose other than or in correlation with entertainment, right? And so if you think about using games for health or for education or for training, or even in some people would say for political statements and art, these are things that aren't necessarily commercial or entertainment oriented. And so they get lumped in this really broad category of serious games or games with a purpose. And then sometimes you also hear a subgenre of that called games for change, which is more political, cultural, message-orienting games that rely on things like metaphor and things like that. But really, in terms of what it is, it's still just a game, right? It's the same. I would like to say it's usually the same tech, but like we talked about Sim, that's not always the case. But yeah, the point is to do something with that game, right? As opposed to just purchase it for your entertainment. One of the other key distinguishing factors is many times the user in the serious game isn't the person who brought it on themselves. So the invitation to play is very different. Like a lot of times the way games come into our lives, people give us games, but very rarely are we asked by some sort of authority figure to play a game. So like if a teacher is asking us to play a game, or a doctor is asking us to play a game, or an employer at Cold Stone Creamery is asking us to play a game, frequently those fall into the serious games title. So they're made a little bit differently. They have a little bit different goal, and the invitation to play is a bit different as well.
Thank you. That's really thorough. I really appreciate that.
Sure.
Before this is over, I'll actually share with you that I just realized I actually had an experience with serious game development, but we didn't call it that because it was this whole other thing.
Yeah, I believe it.
But let me ask you really quick: are there any? Because you said it was a very broad kind of net that was being cast, and everything was grouped under this. What for the layperson? What are some serious games that they either may have heard of or recognized by title or by prestige, as in the game that they use to train blank or something like that?
I think the two sort of most recognizable ones, and they're really on opposite ends of the spectrum. And there's a bunch of cool ones that we can talk about. There's like games for kids with cancer, like Remission, or games to help you understand the federal budget, like Budget Hero. But like big time serious games that people might have heard of, on one end of the spectrum is Fold It, which is the protein folding game, right? Which is which combined crowdsourcing and games and medical research, where people would play these games and they would use that talent and to solve problems for scientists. On the other end of the spectrum was America's Army, which is probably the most played, arguably serious game, because it's really America's Army saw, and then Full Spectrum Warrior on the side, saw commercial releases on platforms like PlayStation, but they were given away by the Army as a recruiting tool, and they were funded by the Department of Defense, and they were an extraordinarily effective recruiting tool. And so it was a game with a purpose other than just pure entertainment, and that was, hey, look, Army is cool. You can be in the Army. Look, it's like this. It's like Call of Duty, but real, right? And so I think that was a really big serious game.
I saw The Last Starfighter, and I'm pretty sure you're just echoing that like plot right there.
I talk about That Dragon Cancer.
Oh yeah, sure. That's huge, right? That's huge.
Yeah.
And That Dragon Cancer is a great one because it sort of skirts that line of, is it a game? Is it a game for change, or is it a serious game, right?
Right. Or This War of Mine is another one.
Yeah, yeah. And That Dragon Cancer, it's beautiful because I think that it was so personal and so intimate and such a piece of art for that family to deal with their kid with cancer, right? And at the same time, try and get that message out to people, right? And it's sort of like, and that's a great one, because like that's the difference between a musician's commercial songs and a musician's like fundraising song, where they might write specifically for, Live Aid.
I was going to just say Band-Aid.
We Are the World, a Band-Aid, right? Like it's still a song, right? It still works as a song. You can still listen to it and make fun of old Sting on them and stuff like that. But it was for a purpose, right? And so the mechanism of creating We Are the World or any of those songs and its purpose is different than a commercial game, even though it's the same people and it's still music. Still 3 minutes long, all that.
I really like that analogy. So how did you get involved in all this? Because that's kind of it's a niche thing, to say the least.
Yeah.
So how did you get involved?
There are a number of ways. So personally, I think that every gamer sort of understands that games are doing something good in their lives. And like anything, right? Like it's anything that you're consuming for a reason. It's doing something for you, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of gamers sort of understand that they've learned a lot from games, and anecdotally will tell you they've learned from games, or that was a stress reliever, or was an important part of their life for whatever reason, right? And then as a scholar, I'd spent most of my career teaching people to make games and then doing games advocacy and education, right? Saying that it's okay to study games, right? And one of the keys to success for that, oddly enough, was serious games. So in the early days when a lot of games programs were starting all over the nation, serious games became an easy example to help parents, community members, governments, school administrators understand that it's okay to study games and it's okay to make games, right? And so if you look at like in education, the transition to where we are today, where we have esports on a college campus, right? And there are teams playing all these awesome commercial games. The origin of that really finds itself in educational games, in games for health. And those were sort of the things that the first foray into games for a lot of universities and a lot of places. And then it all grows from there. When we originally started the Gap Lab, that was one of its goals, right? Was to show that this culture of games and game development isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. It can actually revolutionize the way we do health and medicine. And so that was my goal, was always making it okay to play and study games and to think about a playful life versus a workful life, right? And so that starts off for us with a lot of training people to make games. And then immediately the phone started to ring off the hook with people wanting to make games with us, right? So I was using other people's serious games as an example. We, as a team, started EAE, and it was taking off. And then as soon as we got any sort of press, we got all sorts of people contacting us about, hey, we know you're really good at making games. I've been thinking about making a game for kids fighting cancer, or I've been thinking about a game for this. And then that just rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled into this behemoth we have today of serious games on campus.
It was bananas.
It was bananas. It was bananas. It was a lot of happenstance, to be perfectly honest. But then it was also really, it was a really good fit for us. And it really helped onboard a lot of people in the beginning.
I agree with that. I think a lot of people had this kind of, an unfair bad taste in their mouth about video games in general.
Oh, yeah.
And I have seen that. I'm sure you've seen it way more than I have, but they light up when you tell them about, all the cool things that games do for us. And, they can really, and everybody wants to play games. Everybody used to play games if they don't now. And so it's an easy way for them to be happy about it again.
It is. It's a good conversation. Like I'll start talking about the game that's behind me right now, which is a simulator that helps people with spinal cord injuries learn to ski or sail again, right? Using a sip and puff controller in the mouth or a joystick or a Bluetooth sensor on the face if you can twitch this muscle, right? And that changes the tone of the conversation than starting with Call of Duty, right?
Absolutely.
Every time.
Yeah.
It just opens up people to having, to removing barriers, big cultural barriers they might have to games, and opens up that space.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a leading question because I kind of know the answer to this already, but
I hope I get it right.
I'm sure I don't though, so I'm just ready to like hear it.
So I am aware, Roger, that you have a design framework that you use. And so one of the questions that our students asked me to ask you about this is, do you design games for change or games for health or serious games differently than you would design them for an entertainment only game? And there's a more nuanced part of that, meaning obviously the goal is slightly different, but is there a design process that's different?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. To me, no. Like if there's a binary, the fence is actually in between games that you make as an artist and games you make as a designer. And then design on that side, there's a spectrum of everything from games for entertainment, games for change, and all that kind of stuff. But they're all on that side of the fence, right? And from what I teach, and then I have a process to go along with this, is that there are things that some people want to say and get out into the world. So if you think about like to get overly scholarly about art, an artist sees the world, takes it in, makes a story about that world. It's a compelling, critical, interesting story, and then they get it out. So all the work is happening inside the artist, and the artist is a collection of culture and their history and all of that, and that's where great art comes from, right? And great art comes from great artists, which is why frequently the artist is as interesting as the art in many cases, right? And why we get so disappointed with artists when they let us down,
right?
Like when they write this great, big, beautiful, wonderful book, and then they just say something absolutely terrible, and it's so confusing because all of that work happened inside of them, and now we're like, ew, how close do I want to be to this person, right? But
yeah, that's a really good point.
Right? And then, but what I think with design and serious games makes this really obvious for people, and I think it's one of the ways that serious games is useful for commercial games, is good design solves a problem, right? So if you look at the history of games from the 80s and all the cool things that happened with sounds and graphics, a lot of that was about working with the technical constraints at the time, right? So Ian Bogus wrote about this in Racing the Beam. The way that so many Atari games are built is because of the way that the graphics were drawn and the lines were scanned, right? And so designers at that time were working within constraints. And I guess that's one of my other catchphrases is constraint breeds creativity, right? And so you're supposed to be bringing those constraints in as a designer and then using some design thinking to get things made. So we use a process a lot called the design box, which basically says, it's like a little sarcastic, right? Rather than thinking outside the box, you think inside the box. People pitch us games all the time. And I don't care if it's a commercial game, an entertainment game, or a serious game. Everyone's pitch is terrible, just universally. They're just bad. And that's okay, because the point of your pitch isn't the game that you're pitching. It's the interesting problem that you're solving, right? So like when you pitch a game like Destiny, it isn't that at the time, like they hardly had anything fleshed out. But the problem that they were solving, which was, how do we get this increasingly expensive medium to make a game that's going to have a little bit of a longer tail, right? How can we do what we've seen with MMOs with an FPS, which is, where the graphics are more expensive and the content is more expensive and all that voice acting. Just the creation of an FPS is inherently more expensive minute per minute than many other genres. And so they came up with this cool design to solve a problem, right? Or when the original Halo came out, we're stuck on this Halo stuff. How do you make a first-person shooter that works on a console, right? So Halo is less about Master Chef at that point and more about how do you make this thing work, right? And then it all goes from there, and you can get deep into all the other stuff. And there are, of course, artists who want to do interesting things with those characters, that art, that story, who are embedded in that team. But the role of the designer and the role of design then is to solve problems. And in my mind, and I know this isn't always what people believe, good designers are people who can't always point to what their contribution is in the game, right? Like, all these ideas come from so many sources, from the users, from other developers, from the IP holder, right? And then making sense of that and getting everyone on the same page is the work of design, right? So like when we design something like this, that's dead easy, right? They have a ski chair. They want people to be able to use that ski chair. They want a simulator that simulates the activity, right? And so our design, we're both simulating, which is an easier thing conceptually to do because you're trying to get close to it, but it's never reality, right? Like all that UI element over there, that's not real. That floating in the air stuff doesn't happen when you're sailing, right? And so there still are a lot of design considerations, right? So if good design solves a problem, I think that's true in entertainment games. If you say, oh, look, I'm trying to appeal to a particular demographic, or I'm trying to figure out how to get things to work on iOS, right? When Chair built an Infinity Blade, and it was your first big, beautiful AAA looking game on iOS. Yeah. That's definitely about solving a problem, right? How do we bring the AAA experience to mobile phones, both artistically and design-wise? And they did both. They knocked it out of the park, right?
Absolutely.
but I don't know that any of them grew up dreaming about a swiping game with really beautifully rendered people with swords. Right. And like that was the message they wanted to get out in the world, which is swiping with swords is in my soul, right? But they were good designers and designed an incredible experience with a beautiful art style and in a world that people have written fan fiction about, right? So like that lore also really sang to people's heart. So the work of art in there is real, but the actual design of the thing, that's problem solving.
I love that. You know, I hate to call it a dichotomy, but I like the line that you drew about art, games as art and games as the other thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's easy with the role, the artist versus the designer, right? Yes. There are things that I do that are indie that are kind of art oriented. It's something that I see in the world, or I have a sarcastic statement that I want to make, and I knock out something. Like when I was on a plane and I built my drink cart game about the empathy that I felt for these poor flight attendants who had this just terrible job while the plane's all shaking and they're serving drinks and people are mad, right? I got to say something about this. So I made a little drink cart game that I wasn't solving a problem.
Right.
I had something I want inside myself I wanted to get out. It's also why I'm not a great artist, because my art is the drink cart game, right?
Well, you know, it's probably saying what you wanted it to say, so that's perfectly reasonable art.
I don't think anyone's written fan fiction about it or gotten a tattoo of it yet, so I'm not that successful.
I'm gonna make a plaque for your office that says "Swiping with swords is in my soul," because that's maybe like the best quote that I've ever heard. So Roger, your background, this is obviously something like not only are you passionate about it, but it's something that you kind of have to be passionate about, I imagine, in order to be successful and in order to stick with it for more than like a second. So are you like, how did games come into your life? Like, is something, have you been a gamer for a long time and you've realized their potential? Did it start out as more of a scholarly pursuit? How did you gain this passion that you very clearly have?
Yeah, it is 100% pure luck, right? It was being born in the right place at the right time, having the right people come into your life. I think that a lot of us who were born in the Bay Area in the mid 70s got to grow up in the Bay Area in the mid 80s. And so some things were kind of universal. Like my friends and I, when we would go to the mall in San Mateo, they had video game testing in the mall, and they would just grab people who were under the age of 13 and have them play and test games. And we'd get like $5, I think like a mall gift certificate to play and test games. So it was just around you at that time, right? And I was super lucky. Like one of my uncles was an artist who started off, he was a traditional artist, started off doing painting for back glass for pinball machines, then moved on to jacket art and occasionally box art for Atari 2600 games, and then moved on to game art and left his career. When he finished his career, my Uncle Willie, he was a senior art director and producer at EA and spent like 25 years at EA down in Redwood Shores. So I was lucky to have that kind of stuff around me. And then I was also personally, right? And then also I think it was the time, right? Like I was given computers at a very young age. And when you're given computers at a young age, you want to try and make games and see games and play games. And that just went on and on and on and on. I didn't think I would ever make a career of it. After college, I took a random part-time gig. I had a friend who was a skateboarding journalist, and I had done some journalism. And About.com was hiring for video game journalism. Yeah. And so I said, I can do that. I can write reviews and stuff, right? I did that for like 11 years. And it got bought by the New York Times, right? And that's actually where a lot of my first industry contacts came from, I was this sort of contract games journalist writing for a website in the Web 2.0 days. And that was a bananas time because like nothing I ever do now will ever come close to the readership and influence that we had back then. So like I was anywhere from like at the tail end when it was going poorly, 400,000 unique readers a month. And in the heyday, like 1.5 million unique readers a month, right? And so we're talking about millions of page views. And I was paid by the click, right? So it worked out well for me. And all I was doing was writing terrible PlayStation reviews and Xbox reviews, right? There was nothing special about them. But that time was right. And About.com, before Wikipedia came on, was the single largest content producer on the web of original content. So to be part of that network is what really drove all that traffic more than anything that I ever wrote, right? But in those days are not the same, right? Like it's hard to get those kinds of numbers now, both because competition is fierce, people consume media very differently. But like those numbers were bigger than most newspaper circulation numbers, right? For one games reviewer. And I wasn't even big on the network. Like I was probably mid-tier in that network, right? But they were just so good at it. So all of that, I grew up around games. I grew up playing games. I grew up making games. I remember everything from when I was a young person with my Texas Instruments 99 4A, I would code things out of the back of Family Computer magazine. They would have like 2 pages of code and you would just manually type it in. And then you'd mod it. You didn't know you were modding, but you'd mod it to say funny or sarcastic or swear words or whatever you wanted it to do. And what was hilarious about it was it would, I had no mechanism of saving it or the concept of saving it. For a long time, I thought computing was ephemeral and that you got what was commercially given to you. And then when you wrote stuff, it ran on the computer until you turned the computer off. Right? And then I thought, well, that was that program. Let's do another program, right? No concept of saving, no concept of any of it, right? And then when somebody showed me the tape drive, I'm like, what? All this time, right? But anyway, so I grew up around it. But I also think that I found a lot of comfort in games. I've certainly learned a lot from games in my lifetime. I think that our generation is primed for serious games thanks to Oregon Trail.
Yeah, right.
Other games like that. Yeah. Like in junior high school, the first ever formal education that I had in games was a class called Computers, right? I took computers class. And it was 8 pods in a room that had one Apple IIe in each pod. And then like 4 of us would sit down and we'd go from thing to thing to thing to thing. And they were almost exclusively serious games, whether they knew it or not, right? You were playing some sort of educational game or...
Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Was
Math Blaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. All of it, right? So that was my background into all of this. And then when I started doing them at Utah, they just exploded. And Utah is a big supporter of innovation. So I think that was sort of a natural fit.
So do you think that as far as not only obviously your work, but are serious games, because you mentioned kind of at the beginning, there's kind of this cultural, like, video games are a thing and they're a real thing. And like, to this day, I'm still not sure my dad knows what my job is or thinks that I have a real job.
Yeah, I feel you.
Maybe now that I'm at the U, but like when I was in the industry, he's like, yeah, one day he'll figure it out. Do you think that like serious games are going to get more? Obviously, the game industry is going to grow, but are serious games going to start being more prevalent in different aspects of life as far as like how do you see that going? Or conversely, if you could wave a magic wand, how would you want that to go?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think there's two answers. I think just like people don't see that they're gamers, even though they're playing games like crazy, right? People don't see that they're using serious games when in fact they totally are, right? Like games in education, from pen and paper games to digital games, is like none of us are going to blink. Like no one's going to say, "Oh my gosh, you're not going to believe it. There's a math game for kids," right? Because we all know that there's math games for kids, right? Or that there's a geography game, right? Like no one's going to say, "Did you know there's a game about the capitals," right? And so I think that, who knew, right? Where is Waldrug, Ohio? So I think that people are already, it's so commonplace, but not big enough yet, right? Meaning that there hasn't been a hit. People still reach to things like Oregon Trail when we want to talk about these things, right? All these years later, people are still talking about Oregon Trail. So we don't have that big, aside from like Fold It, right? We haven't had that really big serious game that people talk about as an example. Like there's no dodgeball of serious games. So if you're going to talk about physical education, you're going to talk about dodgeball and the benefits of it and the bad things about it and all of that kind of stuff, right? But we when you talk about games in high schools, there isn't one. And a lot of that has to do with the way that education happens in schools and a lot of the mistakes that serious game developers make about not making games that fit curriculum well. Like the biggest game that I think I've made is Dino Lab. And the only reason it's a dinosaur critical thinking game where you assemble dinosaurs and make hypotheses, and it's awesome. Made it with the Natural History Museum. Really cool project. It's because it was tied to Utah core curriculum, and then other schools did as well. So doing that extra work that is easier perhaps for people at a university to do than a company allowed us to make a game that teachers can assign as part of their curriculum. And I think that's going to be the key for serious games. Is a lot of the stuff that serious games wants to do is externally funded, right? And this is a weird money conversation, but most people don't buy most of their educational materials. It's given to them by schools. So you have to make games that don't just solve the educational problem, but solve the systems problem that fit into a school system. Same with games for health. There's just like there are so many nutraceuticals that claim to do all these magical things. There are all these games that claim to do magical things. So there's all these games that do that will increase your memory or help you sleep better at night or whatever. Brain, exactly, right? But they haven't been clinically validated, and they might do wonderful things, right? But they weren't clinically validated, and even the ones that were, like one of the saddest games I talk about is Remission. They weren't designed in a way or built to be part of the system of delivery for those things, right? So when you make a game for commercial consumption, you make it with commercial delivery in mind, right? You make it so it's not going to offend the GameStop, so it'll launch on the PlayStation Store. For some reason, a lot of times in serious games, they don't do that. They don't think about what's the mechanism that this game is going to get into the hands of people. They just make, this is a game about understanding diabetes, right? And they haven't thought about, well, who's going to distribute this game? How is it going to get distributed? How is it going to get into the user's life? And the same is true of educational games, right? So when I did Dino Lab, we do a lot of participatory design because, again, I believe design is a team practice, right? And one of the members of the team is the user. So when we did Dino Lab, we heard from experts, we got what they wanted, they gave us their pitch, all of that. And I spent about a year working with junior high school students. Probably did more than half a dozen, if not more, 10 design sessions with schools and kids across Utah. And what they told us was wonderful. They told us all the barriers to using games that they would love to use in the classroom. So like the teachers wanted this, they had learning goals that they wanted met. And then they also wanted something that looked good and sounded good and was like a real video game, right? And I get that. The kids told us no sound immediately, no sound. And we're going, what? They're all, okay, so all the headphones are gross. Half the headphone jacks don't work. right? You can't rely on sound, right? And we'd gotten this description of what these multimedia PCs were, and they just weren't. And then the teachers had all these learning goals they wanted, and the students like, no, it can't be more than 10 minutes long, because by the time we walk to the lab, they fail at logging into the computers. They call the IT person. The IT person comes and unlocks all the computers. We really only get 15 minutes of using a computer in a 40-minute computer long class, right? And then so by listening to the students about what the length should be, the content should be, the requirements and restrictions, and then listening to the instructors about what they needed to make a game that they could actually use in the classroom and meet state requirements, we were able to sort of get something that fit that area, right? And so it's just like if you're going to make something for the iOS store, you have to do it the way they want to, as is being shown in the courts right now, right?
Right.
It's a complicated thing. Otherwise, you don't get to have your game in the iOS store. But the same is true of education. Like it's almost identical. There are so many people who have made amazing, beautiful games that are serious games that don't get distributed because they don't meet the platform holder requirements. In this case, education. Health is the other big one, right? How do you get games for health distributed? Most healthcare is complicated in our country, but the idea is that most people get their healthcare through a health system, and there's some form of insurance or payment for that. And so in this space, then you have to build games that can accept insurance or be bought by doctors. And so when I brought up the game Remission is the first, I don't know if it's the first clinically validated game. It's arguably the first clinically validated game to work. It's definitely the first game where we got fMRI studies. So someone playing a game and we're seeing a brain scan of them playing a game, right? Super useful. I use those slides all the time. Your brain does very radically different things when you're playing a game versus watching a movie or reading a book. And we have brain scans to prove it. But so it's clinically validated. It was like a $2 million build. So we're talking like, AA, AAA kind of money back then. And then was really cool to look at. So clinically validated, really cool to look at, got put in every magazine you could imagine on earth. Nobody's playing this game. And why? They made two key mistakes, right? The first is you fly through the bloodstream and shoot things. So in the game is tailored to medication adherence and understanding. You're flying through the bloodstream, blasting cancer cells with various medications, helps you understand the medication, understand the science of what's happening. That shooting business is really hard for hospitals, right? It's one thing for a young adult to bring in a Vita or a Switch and play a violent game that they brought in. It's a totally different thing for a hospital to give a game with a gun to a kid, right? Yeah, so that was a huge barrier. There are a lot of hospitals that actually have bans on violent media. And then the other thing they did was, and this is where I think it becomes really important with our work, is they hired a really cool developer who knew how to make really good action games. And so that's what they made, right? So the scientists did their science and the game developers did their game development, but it's not chocolate and peanut butter. You can't just put these things together and end up with a Reese's peanut butter cup, because the game developers developed the avatar for commercial viability. So it was a sexy robot lady. And on the cover of the box, she's like in the Charlie's Angel pose where she's showing you the backside and the gun in the air and the whole thing. And that might have, and it was, it was a well-designed character. It might be very appealing to certain people, but it's just like, I remember I had a pediatric cancer doc, like drop a copy of it on my desk and say, so we can't make this, right? And I'm going, gee, tell me why not? Sexy robot lady with gun game for kids, right? And again, and the commercial space very different. It just wasn't an understanding of the space of the platform. So
I think that's the first thing I said to you about that.
Yeah, right. It's problematic.
I was like, well, okay, this is going to appeal to 13-year-olds, and that's about it.
Yeah, and that was the target. It was for 13-year-olds, but the point of a serious game is it's actually just like a commercial game. It's the target audience is the person not just playing the game, but the buyer.
Right.
So you have to make games that parents and grandparents are going to be comfortable. That's why Skylanders did so well. Right. You could buy those toys, and they understood buying those toys for people, right? Or Disney Infinity.
Right.
And so the same thing where your grandparents are comfortable buying you a leapfrog, right? or buying you rabbit algebra.
Right.
But, like, sexy carbon monoxide blaster, right? The game about carbon monoxide is going to be a tougher sell, right? And so you get it. So what I really wish I think is happening, which is the developers had a hard time making games for these systems because there wasn't a relationship. Platform holders in industry have developer relations people and systems of doing that. So when they stopped being so first party oriented and they realized the future of games was third party or second party, you had to create mechanisms of people to have those relationships. It's why the stores did so much for games, right? Like with Epic and its store and Steam and iOS, because it opened up that relationship to more developers, right? It made it easier to have a relationship with a platform. That's still a mystery. Like if people wanted to make a medical game right now, it's a mystery on how you get one into a hospital. And so you just make it and hope for the best. So I think that with new FDA regulations, and then like I work at a hospital to solve that problem. My lab is at a hospital. It's how I solve the problem of how do you get a game in a hospital. We cart up all the students and the staff and the faculty to the hospital and work there. And that makes it easier. But that's the big problem, to be honest, in my mind, is if schools will approve games and making a mechanism for schools to approve games, hospitals we'll see games everywhere, right? And it'll be glorious, right? If you're going to learn or you're going to work out, it might as well be fun.
So we're coming up to the end of timing.
Oh, I'm so sorry I talked too much.
No, it's great. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. I know that you probably feel like these are all your kids, and so I'm asking you to pick your favorite, but maybe not your favorite, but the one that you think is the best illustration of the kind of work that you're doing at the Gap.
Yeah, so I think that the obvious ones are these kind of fun video game looking simmy ones. They're really easy, and anything involving rehab is super easy to wrap your mind around. This is a fun game that was actually not a success for us, right? It was really cool. It's a medication compliance app. It links up to your electronic medical record system, shows you your pills, grow a flower when you take your pills. Core design was a bad idea, right? Because you need play for games to work, and you don't want people to play with their meds. Some meds matters less when you take them during the day, right? But some meds, you have to take the right amount or it might kill you. And if you take them in the wrong order at the wrong time, it can have serious health consequences. So a game where someone says, well, I'm going to save all my points to the end to try and get more water for the plant. It was no bueno, right? And so it never got distributed. We prototyped it out, and we said, oh, it's got some problems in terms of design, so we shelved it. But I think the game that perhaps I think is a good one to talk about is this one, which is Virtual Home Sim. Virtual Home Sim will be released to, we're probably going to be having about 500 different people testing this out come October. Wow. And it's a virtual reality trainer for social workers, right? And a gamified virtual reality trainer. Right now, when you're a social worker, you go to school to be a social worker, and then you go be a social worker. And your simulated experience was a one-time shot in a theater where they hired actors to be in a fake home, right? A lot of young social workers really struggle with cultural bias and with things being a little scary or new, and they see danger too many places. Where in reality, a lot of homes that are messy or may not be something you're comfortable with are perfectly safe, happy, loving environments for young people. And so, like, just because a house is messy, that might be a bad sign. But if that mess is children's clothes and toys and things like that, that's actually a loving, caring home. It's just a messy home, right? So what VHS does, it allows us to visit homes, take 360 photographs of every room, and then have very experienced social workers, a panel of experts, go through it, tag everything for a protective or dangerous measure. And then we have people go through it as well. And it seems like where they can talk, and it gives them their notes, they fill out all the forms, and it's like playing social work. And it's actually really fun, right? Because these homes are real homes. We got to go into a hoarder's home. We got to go into a bachelor pad. We get to go, like, and the bachelor pad had all sorts of dangerous things. It's nice and neat and clean. There's no sign of the kid there.
Oh.
Right? It's like the kid is invisible in this home, right? And that's actually, you would worry less about it, because when you walk in, you go, this is a nice home, right? Like, this place is dialed in. And then when you go to the hoarder's home, you're like, oh my God, this is just awful, right? But there was at least proof of life in the hoarders home for the kids, right? You're going, where does this kid sleep? And where do they do their homework? And, and so it's a nuanced thing. It's something you want to be experimental and playful with. You want to be able to make a guess and find out before you go out into the real world, right? And you want to be able to have those arguments. You say, look, I thought a vodka bottle was dangerous. And you go, well, it all depends. Is that vodka bottle empty and on the side of the bed, or is it in the freezer? These mean radically different things, right? Or like some people get trained and they get really caught up on aluminum foil. Oh my gosh, I found like aluminum foil in the home and it really got me worried that they're, smoking cocaine or something, right? And
I don't mean to laugh about that, but oh my gosh.
Right? Little burnt pieces of aluminum foil in the den on the coffee table are radically different than shards of aluminum foil that are around that were being used for arts and crafts. So there's a lot of nuance and stuff there. And I think it's a game that's really going to help out a lot of people. And we're going to see like 10 jurisdictions start using it here. And so I'm super excited about it. I think it's going to help a lot of people.
That's awesome.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's completely fascinating.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thanks for the opportunity. It really means a lot.
We really appreciate you and what you're doing. And I always learn something when I talk to you. So.
And vice versa. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
And hey, it was fun getting serious about games.
No.
All right, I love it.